we'll move along with what promises to be a most interesting night. Um, Tonight we have lecturing to us Professor Rachel Moss, who is head, who is head of, sorry, who is head of art and the history of art and architecture in Trinity. The areas she covers, her particular interests is medieval Ireland, 400 to 1600. And she's been all sorts of things like head of the Royal Society and professor, and all sorts of things, which I won't. I'm looking forward to this enormously. So shut up, Murphy, and we'll get on with it, all right? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Charlotte, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's brilliant to be here this evening with the Thomond Archaeological Society. And as I was saying to Charlotte earlier on, I love coming to speak to local history and archaeology societies, not so much because of what I tell them, but more from what I can learn from everybody else in the questions at the end. So what I wanted to do today this evening, was to talk a little bit about possibly the most famous bishop of late medieval Ireland, Cornelius O'Dea. Famous not necessarily because we know a lot about him through documentary history, but because we can actually glean quite a lot about him through the, I suppose, near miraculous survival of a number of artifacts that are associated with him. So obviously those that are most familiar are probably his mitre and crozier, which are currently on loan to the Hunt Museum from the diocese, the Catholic Diocese of Limerick. The so-called Black Book, very valuable document which recorded various legal documents to do with St. Mary's Cathedral. And also the remnants of his tomb, now looking very, very sad, in the south transept of St. Mary's Cathedral. But we do have a record of what once must have been a really fabulous monument. And bearing in mind that in those days, patrons chose their own graves or gravestones, tomb markers, and paid for them. They're particularly important in terms of giving us an insight into how O'Dea both saw himself, but perhaps more importantly, wanted others to see him in perpetuity. What I'm also going to do then is look at a couple of other, perhaps less well-known things that I think might also be associated with his time as bishop, and really to flag quite how interesting and important this individual was, and how important Limerick was as a centre of production, but also of trade during the time of his episcopacy. So that's what's in store for the next 50 minutes or so. So first of all, briefly, and again, I'm very conscious that I'm not preaching, but I am talking here to the experts, but I assume some know some bits and some don't know other bits. So very briefly, just to speak about a little bit about what we know about his biography. Who was Cornelius O'Dea? Well, we know very little about the person. There are a number of references to him in various different sources. And what we can glean from these sources, and these are not just Irish sources, but also sources in the Vatican archives, is firstly, and unusually, although not so much in those days, for a bishop, he was the illegitimate offspring of obviously unmarried parents, and also had at least one son and possibly up to 3. So straight away, he's an unusual individual to hold such a high-ranking position. He came from a relatively privileged background. He was one of the O'Deas of Diocese O'Dea, and there's the O'Dea Castle looking very beautiful in an early morning March mist. And as you'll know, the O'Deas were an important sector of the Dáil Cóis. So they were an important family in their own right. And I haven't actually been able to find a primary source for it, but it is said that he was fostered by the very powerful O'Brien family. So although he was illegitimate, he seems to have had quite a good start in life and knew all of the right people. And that would seem to carry through when we look at his career, because either he was very well connected or he was very shrewd, and most likely he was both. The reason I say this is because our first reference to him as a churchman, as a cleric, is in 1394, when he's referenced as being a lowly subdeacon in Killaloe Cathedral. Within 6 years, he'd risen to be Bishop of Limerick. So there was something going on there straight off. That is a stellar career path. Now, there's a bit of intrigue even at this point. O'Dea was ordained Bishop of Limerick in 1400. But even his elevation to the see was contentious at the time. And there's correspondence in the Vatican archives. Unfortunately, it's one of those sources that tells you just enough to get you really frustrated and wanting to know the whole story. But basically, O'Dea replaced the former bishop, Peter Curra, who had been moved to the See of Ross, so Ross Carbery down in West Cork. And for some unknown reason, Peter didn't fancy going down to West Cork. I would have thought, actually, Ross Carbery's kind of nice. But anyway, so as soon as he got the transfer, he appealed to the Pope to please be reinstated in Limerick. And the correspondence that survives basically says, well, I have reinstated you, but it appears the paperwork never came through. So sorry, O'Dea is in there and he's staying. Now that sounds very suspicious, but I can't speculate as a historian. But again, it suggests maybe a hidden letter somewhere along the way or something like that. There's clearly something a little bit contentious about his elevation. He remained bishop for almost a quarter of a century, or actually just over a quarter of a century. Again, in 1424, he was summoned by the government to answer certain charges. Unfortunately, again, we don't know what he did. And charges were made against him. And whatever the accusation was, he tendered his resignation 2 years later in 1426. And just 7 years after that, he died. So that's a potted history of his career. Now, what is, I suppose, more interesting is what he achieved in those 25 years, that in the absence of documents, when we're actually looking at the visual remains, perhaps tell us a little bit more about who this man was, how political he was, and maybe also how pious he was. So I want to go back to when he started as bishop in 1400 and to look at the cathedral that he came into. So obviously as a bishop, you want to have a grand cathedral that is, I suppose, becoming of your situation in life. You want it to be very beautiful and fashionable and to function very well. Now, just under 40 years before O'Dea took up the bishopric, we have again a record from the Vatican of a plea for indulgences. So this is basically looking for aid towards building work, and this was quite common, where the Pope would issue indulgences to the citizens of Limerick or whoever came and visited and made contributions towards the fabric of the building. This is issued in 1362-3. It's January 1363 when the new year was in March, so that's why it's got the slash, because it would now be 1363. Basically, it mentions that the cathedral has suffered, the belfry, the bells, the buildings, and there's great deterioration, so much so that cathedral funds cannot make good the damage without the contributions of the faithful. So clearly the cathedral is not in good condition. And the question is, well, why? Limerick was a wealthy place by this time. But what's very interesting is if you go and look at the annals of that year, in fact it's 1362, both in Ireland, but actually right across into England, the various historical chronicles that were being written there, and up to Denmark, it becomes very clear that this is probably the result of very topical climate change. This was in the middle of a mini ice age in the 14th century, and there are a number of very damaging storms that took place throughout the 14th century, including one that lasted for 5 days from January 15th, 1362. All of the Irish sources just have the same one line, and they say very boldly that there were, this great storm destroyed many buildings and churches and sank many ships. But you get a lot more detail in overseas chronicles. So in the UK, for example, English chronicles record significant damage to St Pancras Church, the Church of the Austin Friars in London, Norwich Cathedral, and the entire gateway of St Albans collapses. And 60 parishes in Denmark were submerged by a tidal wave from the sound of it, and many ships were sunk. So my suspicion is the hurricane hit St Mary's, and it had a tower at that time. And from looking at the architecture, and I have two experts sitting over there, so I'm really nervous saying this, but there are anomalies in the architecture of the cathedral at the crossing, so that's the transition from the nave into the chancel, that suggest it may once have had a tower not at the west end, but a low squat tower of the type that we find in some Cistercian monasteries, actually at the crossing, that this is the tower that potentially might have been damaged. Now, interestingly, the 14th century, although it tends to be associated with the Black Death and an economic decline, was actually a period where you see a lot of changes being made to great church architecture, in particular to cathedrals and to a lesser degree to wealthy parish churches. And there's a reason for this. After the initial construction of many, in particular of the cathedrals in the 12th century, in the early 13th century, following the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, there's a much greater emphasis placed on the pageantry around the Mass. So the singing of the liturgy, the need to have a greater collection of relics and then therefore minor altars and chapels to accommodate them. And then particularly after the Black Death, there's a far greater emphasis on death, unsurprisingly, but also a fixation with this idea of dying a good death. So in other words, giving money to a church so that you'll be remembered in the faithful's prayers after you die, and that'll help your journey through purgatory. But also, if you can afford it, to have a very fancy tomb that will remind people to say prayers for you after your death, or if you can really afford it, a specific chapel that is a semi-private space in the church that holds your tomb, perhaps a couple of other ancestral tombs, with a staff of one or more chaplains who pray for you every single day. And you endow them, and you basically endow enough money to pay their salary. And this is going to be absolutely gold standard. You will get into heaven as quickly as is possible. So these four things actually begin to instigate changes in church architecture right across Ireland as the funds become available. And just very briefly, to give a couple of examples, I could give a whole lecture on this because it's fascinating, but for example, at Tuam Cathedral, they start to build a massive long choir in and around 1312. They run out of money. The idea was to rebuild the whole church. So when you go down there now, in fact, it's the vestry, is this huge long choir, and then they have a tiny little stubby nave because they ran out of funds. Equally in Clogher up in County Tyrone, Bishop Matthew McCohasig, who I'm going to come back to in a little while, totally rebuilt his cathedral and also gave it many gifts, so things to adorn the altar, and this is where I'll come back when we're looking at OD in a little while. And then closer to St Mary's in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin in 1355, so very shortly after sort of the beginnings of the recovery of the city from the Black Death, they build a vast new long choir. The architecture isn't great, but the interior fittings are very beautiful. So clearly there are ambitious churchmen who want to extend their cathedrals and make them more fit for purpose as we move into the 15th century. So basically, work is underway on St Mary's when OD arrives into it. And there's some evidence that the West Tower, which we assume basically what happened is they decided not to retain a crossing tower, probably with very good reason. First of all, if you're having to reconstruct that, it's going to be very, very disruptive to liturgical worship. Also, by moving it to the West End, you can build it much taller. And again, the 14th century is the century of the Battle of the Towers, where people were building taller and taller towers. Salisbury Cathedral being a very good example. I still remember it's 321 metres from those Russian spies who had learned that off Wikipedia. But everybody is trying to go taller, and in particular porch towns, partly for navigation, that these were, you know, important markers, sea markers, as you're coming in to land at the port. They could also be used as lookout towers. Some church towers were also used as a fire tower, so like a lighthouse that you'd actually light a fire at the top to help guide shipping. It was also a symbol of power. If you lived in a city with multiple towers, it showed it was an important city. And we've lots of evidence of this, of merchants particularly helping to fund the building of towers. So in 1401, just 1 year after O'Dea comes to the episcopal throne, we're told that the merchant John Budston had given a gift of 4 bells to the cathedral. So that suggests that that tower is certainly ready up to the belfry, the one that we see today, and that it's almost complete. So also at this time, we know that Budston had commissioned a new chantry chapel for himself. Now, the term chantry means singing, so basically this is one of those private chapels I was talking about where he could build himself a nice fancy big tomb, and the idea was to try and be buried as close as possible to the high altar. That's where all the business of the church is taking place. So if you're within eyesight of the celebrant at the high altar, they're going to remember you, and you're therefore going to be subliminally remembered in prayers, and it's all towards that speedier journey to heaven. So Budston had constructed a chantry chapel dedicated to St Mary Magdalene in the kind of southeast corner of the cathedral, and I'll show you a plan in a second. And then another merchant had added on to that, so basically you'd enter them through the south transept, and a second chapel was erected in honour of St James, so presumably it was built perhaps to commemorate somebody who had been on pilgrimage, and we know that it was built by Thomas Balbane and then later became the Stritch Chapel. So straight away around the time that O'Dea is arriving, some of the wealthier merchants are beginning to build their own private chapels. So this is what he arrives into. And incidentally, that Budston name you might be familiar with from looking at this tomb in the cathedral. In fact, this was made a little bit later by Budston's great-granddaughter. Clearly his own tomb had been destroyed, and she commissioned 2 new tombs for the Budston Chapel. This is subsequently moved, it's now in the south transept. But it gives you an idea of how fancy these monuments were, even a couple of generations later. And this one particularly interesting in that the carvings include merchants' marks. Just showing you here. And these are, for those who didn't have heraldry, if you weren't a noble person, but you were a wealthy merchant, you would use these marks on your goods, sort of like your own personal stamp. So it's interesting to find these on the Budston Memorial. So basically, this is what the cathedral is potentially like when O'Dea becomes bishop. So I've just described the erection of the West Tower, which you can see there in red, and the erection of the 2 chapels off the south transept. Now the choir at this time was probably quite short. And again, Brian, in your excavations, I think, or they may already have been discovered, but there was discovered a foundation basically coinciding with where my black lines end and my green ones begin. Might have been a choir screen, but also potentially suggests that originally the chancel was a little bit shorter. And it would have been very short for a cathedral at this time, particularly when you've got the canons in the cathedral who are helping to sing the liturgy of the Mass. They've got to go somewhere. They've got to go in their stall. So there's very little space available there. And particularly with the addition of these 2 chantry chapels, it means there's no access other than right through the church. And typically you would have a side door to the chancel. So the Arthur manuscripts include a reference to some work going on in the chancel by Thomas Arthur, again one of the very wealthy merchants at the time, and his wife Joan Murrah. says they built at their own expense in a magnificent manner the eastern front, so that's the east window, the east gable, of the cathedral church, and the western door of which Arthur had caused to be sculpted in a workmanlike manner in stone. That suggests it was very decorative. It was probably a choir screen. They're calling it a door, but as it's western, it's what I'm showing there with the hatched line. And with the armorial bearings of the Arthurs, the southern door, which I'm showing there on the south side, had the armorial bearings of the Murrs, not through a spirit of vainglory, but in order that others should imitate the memorials of their piety. In other words, everybody should be doing this for the church. This appears to have been built probably during the time of OD, because Thomas Arthur dies in 1426. And we know that the Arthurs and indeed OD are buried in the east end of the church. Building an entire new eastern gable probably also entailed the purchase of new stained glass for the chancel and the purchase of a great stained glass window, I assume covered in the heraldry of the Murrs and the Arthurs, that everybody worshipping in the cathedral would have seen. So basically, this is sort of OD's domain, because he's the bishop. This is his place of work, if you like, is in the chancel of the cathedral. Now, I've already noted the chantry chapels and the idea of being buried as close as possible to the high altar. We know that originally OD's tomb was located here, to the north of the high altar, and then a reference in the will of Thomas Arthur's son, Nicholas, who became a very important merchant in his own right, records that he wants to be buried in the tomb of my ancestors near the left-hand horn, which is the corner, of the high altar, and that's important, in the choir of the Blessed Church of Mary on the south side. So that's very explicit. So I've marked their tomb on the south side here. Now, we don't know what that Arthur tomb looked like, and we've no idea either of the financial outlay of the Arthurs, but I imagine it was considerable if we credit them with the extension of the chancel, which I think seems to be right, because it allows enough space for these grand tombs to be inserted. Here, a comparison perhaps with a merchant, a female merchant, called Joanna Whiffler or Wallflower, who was wife of Robert Gardner, keeper of the ports of Galway, Cork, Kinsale and Youghal. Okay, so more of the southern ports. She was a very prodigious patron, and we have a record of what she spent. So here we can kind of make a comparison. She invested money in the friary at Athenry, and we know that she paid 20 marks, and I'll convert all of this into modern currency in a minute, for a tomb that was brought from over the seas. And then and this is in 1420, so it's exactly contemporary, and she spent over 100 marks in reglazing. 100 marks, I will tell you that, I'll tell you it's a lot. It's about, let me think, very off the top of my head, it's about 60,000 euros, something like that, just on the reglazing of Athenry Friary. What's interesting about her in terms of providing a comparison is that she was obviously very close to Nicholas Arthur, Thomas's son, because she left him a house in her will, a house in Cork. So there are these merchants who are moving in similar circles and are investing a lot of money in the decoration of churches right across the country. No trace of the Arthur tomb now survives, but we must assume that it was suitably grand to make an impact. And it's noteworthy that Nicholas, who I've just referred to, was involved in the exportation of worked stone. We know he supplied the royal court with a shield of black limestone, presumably from a local quarry, that was carved with 3 leopards of the royal arms. And just 2 years following his father's death, so in 1428, a ship that he had leased was hijacked, and among its cargo was pillars and tables made from polished stone and variegated marble. So if he's exporting this kind of stone to the royal court, his parents' tomb is going to have been really fancy. here's where I did the translation. His cargo, which was hijacked, was worth 700 marks. So that's just over 300,000 or 700 cattle in today's money. So there you go. So there are vast sums being spent here. Now, in terms of O'Dee's monument, we know a little bit more. We know a little bit more because a drawing of it made by Thomas Dyneley in 1681. Don't get excited by that, it's not O'Dea, but it's to show you what it would have looked like. This drawing was made in 1691, by which time O'Dee's monument had already been altered quite considerably. But we are told that it's made from alabaster, and we are told that it has been put on a newer plinth, and I'll come back to the plinth in a little while. But firstly, just to look at the idea of alabaster tombs. And this is what O'Dee's tomb, or his effigy, would probably have looked at. Now, you're probably all sitting too far away to be able to see it, but this tomb, which dates to a little bit earlier than O'Dee's, is covered in graffiti because alabaster is an incredibly soft material. And so it's very, very easy to mark or to chip off. Alabaster memorials had been around for about 100 years before O'Dee's one would have been made at some point during his lifetime. The very earliest that's recorded is the tomb of Edward II in Gloucester Cathedral. So it was always a material that was used either for, well, initially for royalty and then for very high-ranking ecclesiastics, either bishops or archbishops. So O'Dea was clearly aware of this. And not only, I suppose, was it expensive, but also it held a particular symbolism. So it was easy to carve, so you could get really close details, and I'll show you a couple of other examples in a minute. But it was also seen to be a substitute for the white marble that was associated with ancient Rome. And the Roman Church being the cradle of the Christian Church in northwestern Europe, this was seen as important to try and reflect, let's say, some of the great tombs of the early popes. The whiteness, it was felt, also was symbolic of Christian spirituality and purity. And in Albertus Magnus's early 13th century book of minerals, basically this is one of these encyclopedia that gives you all of the different properties of minerals. It's treated under a different name, it's called Nicomer. And he says, Nicomer is the same as alabaster, which is a kind of marble, but because of its marvellous power, is placed among precious stones. And he goes on to observe that the coldness of the stone, the temperature of it, was used to preserve ointments. So it was used, it was thought, by the three Marys at the tomb of Christ, so that the ancients used it for ointment boxes, but also for corpses. And therefore, they used it for tombs because it had the ability to preserve. So it was being used for all of these different reasons, and it was always a very high status material. Now, during the period that we're talking about, there was a very active workshop, well, there were two actually, in kind of northeast England, one around Derby and one in Nottinghamshire, where they were located adjacent to alabaster quarries. And over the course of the later 14th century and into the 15th century, they were basically producing tombs and also other decorations for churches, which I'll show you in a minute, on an industrial scale and exporting quite a lot of them. Just to show you a couple of other examples that are a little bit more contemporary with O'Dea, and important for getting to know a couple of characters. These are important bishops' tombs. We have Bishop William Courtney at Canterbury Cathedral here from 1396. And perhaps more importantly, Bishop William Wickham in Winchester Cathedral. And here you can see he has his own chantry chapel, which he's produced this beautiful cage around. And typically alabasters were painted, and that's what you're looking at here. It's painted and gilded. And he's got some cross-looking angels helping him up to heaven. Now, the reason I'm showing you Wickham's is because he died in 1404. So O'Dea was already Bishop of Limerick, whilst Wickham is Bishop of Winchester, but he's very many other things. He, a bit like O'Dea, came from, well, not quite nothing, but he had a very stellar career. started off as a keeper of works for royal castles. In other words, he was a building foreman in today's parlance. But he became known by the king, who appointed him then as a chaplain, and very gradually he rose to bishop, but also Lord Chancellor, as a Minister for Finance for England. He was thought to be the richest man in England at his death, wealthier than the king. So this is why he was able to, he actually built most of this cathedral as well, and then built this very fancy chapel and tomb for himself, all at the time that O'Dea is bishop. Typically, if you couldn't afford a whole chantry for yourself, most of these monuments were covered by a canopy. And this was almost to reflect that the body was like a relic in a reliquary. It was being protected by this canopy. So it was emphasizing the importance of the person. So just to show you that as well in the alabaster tradition. Now, we know of very few of these alabaster monuments, particularly at the time of O'Dea. One of the reasons may be expense. We do have a bill for this tomb surviving. These are actually just an aristocratic couple who lived quite close to the alabaster quarries, so there wouldn't have been much travel involved. But that tomb cost 40 medieval pounds, so that's about €17,000 in today's money. And that's without a canopy, that's just for the double effigy. So if you're looking at a canopy, you're talking about more money, and transport would have been very expensive. The other reason perhaps that we don't have any surviving is simply because of the softness of alabaster. I can show you, I think, the sole surviving alabaster effigy that I know of anyway in Ireland, and I'd love to hear if anybody knows of another one. And it's in my place of work, and I shouldn't really be showing you this, but I'm going to. Because one of our founders, Luke Challoner, he was one of the founding fellows of the university in 1592. And he was given pride of place in the university chapel when he died in 1618. This was Dyneley's image of him, so actually very similar tomb to what we see of O'Dea. This is what it looks like today, because when the original chapel was demolished, it was decided to move the tomb outside because it was too big. That is what happens if you put an alabaster tomb in the rain. That's what it did look like, you know, hands raised in prayer. That is rainwater. It was outdoors from the early 18th century, and it was finally rescued in about 1970, and it's languishing now in the crypt of the chapel, which is totally closed off to anybody, including me. So he's just not seen anymore, but that's why. Broken across, and that's what would have happened. So again, when we're looking at what might have happened to the O'Dea monument, well, we have some clues, and again, Clodagh Tate of this parish, this very institution, and also Brian O'Dowlick have both written about his tomb. Clodagh in particular, looking at the circumstance under which his tomb moved. So basically, this is what's left of his tomb. It's black limestone, and there is an inscription on it. It's very hard to read now, but it was recorded in the 18th century. And it basically tells us that this was O'Dea's tomb, his burial place. He was translated or moved from his original burial place to the burial place of the bishops of Limerick, that he might rest with his brethren in 1621. And he also then, the tomb was moved, and this was basically to make way for an even bigger tomb, for the O'Briens, the Earls of Thomond, who had become Protestant and so decided to move their traditional burial place from Ennisfriery into the great cathedral at St Mary's and claim the patron space, because they claimed that Donat O'Brien or Donat O'Brien was the founder of the cathedral. Therefore, they should move into the founder's place. So what we're seeing is a game of hopscotch / leapfrog of tomb moving in order to claim authority over the structure. So this was what was erected in the space that had previously been occupied by O'Dea's monument. As you can see, a vast limestone monument. But as Clodagh has suggested, when moving O'Dea's monument just simply onto a black plinth, they probably took down a much fancier structure over it, so probably a canopy, and also, I assume, carvings around the base, basically so that they weren't outdone by O'Dee's monument. And then we learn from various sources, in particular John Loveday, when he comes to visit Limerick in 1732, that the monument, the effigy was still on its plinth, but locals were chipping bits off it to use as a cure for the, quote, bloody flux, which I understand is a stomach complaint. And actually, if you think about it, alabaster is chalk. So it's like eating a giant bit of rennie or, you know, what's it called, Gaviscon or whatever, dissolving it in water. So it probably did actually act as a cure rather than being something superstitious. And we think that the tomb was pretty much gone by the end of the 18th century, probably just because it looks so scrappy. It may well have just been moved into the churchyard and melted, like our monument of Chandler. So that's his tomb. Now, it may be gone, but it may well have had an impact on the neighbourhood, because we only have to go a little bit up the road to Ennis, to this tomb, which I'm sure is familiar to probably everybody in the room. Originally outside in the south wall of Ennis Friary, known as often as the Cray McMahon tomb, but I think it should be the Cray McMahon O'Brien tomb, almost certainly built as the ancestral tomb of the O'Briens. They were the patrons of the church at Ennis. We have records of literally tens of them being buried there, and the style of the tomb is far too early for the McMahons, who Luke Wadding tells us restored the chancel and a tomb in the chancel in the 17th century. This isn't a 17th century monument. So what I'm showing you here is before the monument was moved indoors and taken apart. So it has the canopy that was added by the Crays in the 19th century. And then you can see carved panels. We've got a row of apostles at the top there. My mouse isn't working. There we go, here. And then we've got various scenes from the Passion of Christ around the bottom. And this is almost certainly an incorrect reconstruction by the Crays when they rebuilt it. This is the original canopy that would have gone over it. These are the panels that show different scenes from the Passion, crucifixion and resurrection of Christ around the edge, with a bishop at one end and an enigmatic lady reading a book at the other. I suspect, and here's just a detail of that fabulous canopy that was over, the detailed work that went into that. These are carved from limestone, but very early on, John Hunt and then latterly various other scholars have all agreed these are influenced by the Nottinghamshire School of Alabaster Carvers. And just to show you an example, there they are. This is actually an altar retable or an altar panel. In other words, if I'm at an altar, this is the decoration behind. And these were regularly exported from Nottinghamshire. So I think the O'Briens probably commissioned a limestone one for Ennis, and then they had the apostles around the bottom of their tomb. Why does this matter? Well, where did they see the alabaster? They're the O'Briens. They had lots of money. But if there was an alabaster tomb down the road in Limerick, are they perhaps mimicking that? And was there also a carved altar panel, if you like, an altar retable, something behind in St Mary's? I would be very surprised if there wasn't. Now, we could argue that, yes, Ennis is the smoking gun. St Mary's must have had an altar retable showing scenes from the crucifixion and passion. Yes, except it was dedicated to Mary. So more likely is somewhere like St Saviour's in Limerick. And in fact, in the inventories of possessions after the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid-16th century, there is a reference to an alabaster table, which means a retable. It can also mean just a single plaque in the Church of the Crutched Friars. So we know other churches did have alabasters. More likely for St Mary's would have been a background with scenes from the life of Mary. And again, we have evidence that there was probably one of these in Ireland, because in Tralee Friary, and that's the ancestral burial place of the Desmonds, the Earls of Desmond, we have a couple of panels surviving, now ex situ, one built into the wall, one in a rockery, that again very much mimic the kind of iconography that we see in alabasters. So again, we're getting these echoes out from what was a very important point of importing these types of goods that are resonating with some of the key important families in the area at the time. Now, to move on to something that will be more familiar, the mitre and crozier. And again, I'm not going to tell you everything that you already know, and a lot has been published on this, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things, and more to put it in context. So, as you know, we have surviving the precious mitre of OD. Typically, bishops had 3 mitres. There's the everyday one, there's a slightly better one, and then there's the precious one, which is only worn on very special occasions. And that's what survives down to the present day, almost. The fanons, or insulae, these bits that hang off the back, were replaced sometime in the 19th century, but not before a drawing had been made of them. And this shows quite how interested Cornelius OD was in self-image. This would have been passed down to subsequent bishops, as indeed it was. And so he really wanted himself to be remembered as the patron of this. So we have a very important inscription around here, and it continues up here, that not only tells us that he commissioned it, it also tells us the year, 1418, and the name of the maker, Thomas O'Carroll. And that's particularly important because had we looked at that without a maker's name, we would have assumed that OD imported this. But O'Carroll is a name that turns up in the later 15th century as a name of one of the canons in St. Mary's. It's an unusual name in the Middle Ages. So we're assuming this is a Limerick-based goldsmith, and he's a very skilled one. Just to point out the other thing that he makes very personal, now lost, in these sort of streamers that come down the back, the fanons, you can see there's a heart here, and it says NEL. And that is what's known as a rebus. They're quite common in the Middle Ages. Corn in Latin is heart, nel, Cornelius. So he's really pushing it. I made this. And he also shows himself venerating the Virgin Mary, patron of his cathedral. And the mitre, according to John Hunt, who studied it in great detail, has 160 gemstones, and some are of paste. And then tiny little pearls are stitched into that floral decoration. And the gemstones are interesting because a lot of them coincide with the gemstones that are described in the New Testament as forming the walls of the heavenly Jerusalem. So there is a symbolism in there as well that he was clearly aware of. So this is a really beautiful work of art. Now, what can we compare it to? Well, remember William Wickham, richest man in England? His precious mitre also survives. Now, that's what it looked like before it was conserved. And that's what it looks like now. Cheap old stones, sapphires, or sorry, not sapphires, turquoise and paste. No metal, no crystal, as the crystal cross in OD's. This is his precious mitre. And it basically disintegrated. Now, there are similarities. You've got the stitched pearl foliage and everything else. This is nowhere as good as OD. So this is where the context is everything. Similarly, we have the fantastic crozier that also survives. We assume also made by O'Carroll, although his name isn't attached to it. Again, we've got an image of the Annunciation, so this is very much a Marian theme, so it fits in with the cathedral. And then various saints. I won't go into the identification, lots of people have done that before. But you have these beautiful enamel backgrounds. Here they're green and blue, and you have green and blue enamel here. And then this fabulous, what we call a knop, basically here. And then the bishop holds it right here. And guess what? William Wickham's crozier also survives. Look, they're really similar. Except for the enamels are slightly different at the head, but this in particular is quite similar. So OD is obviously looking across the sea going, who's the best bishop? Who am I going to copy? So that's kind of interesting. And then when we come back and we look at the circumstances under which such things are made, I'm showing you here, I mentioned earlier on in the lecture that Clogher Cathedral was totally rebuilt in the early 14th century by Bishop Matthew McCausig, and we have a really good record surviving in the register of Clogher Cathedral of that time. And it tells us not just that he rebuilt the entire cathedral, but it also tells us what he gave to help fit it out in a fitting manner. And I've highlighted two things in green. Maybe first, at the lower one, He bought sholsable, so these are all obviously liturgical vestments, a mitre and a stole, an alb, a beautiful mitre of silk of Irish workmanship. And they stress that. So this is something that's important, because below then he buys pontifical vestments from London for him and his canons. And it's coming from London because it's that fabulous embroidery, Opus Anglicum it's known as. But clearly a mitre from Ireland is something that's worth actually boasting about. The other thing that he mentions is a crucifix of gilded silver having the relics of St. Macartan, who's the patron of the cathedral. That is a head bone from his head beneath the feet of the crucifix in the form of a shield. Now, Wickham also gave a golden cross with a relic to Winchester Cathedral. And John Hunt, when he was looking at the Arthur Cross here in Limerick, on loan also to the Hunt Museum, suggested that some of these gems looked uncannily like the same settings as you find on Bishop O'Dee's mitre. And although this cross is dated on the underside with an inscription that credits it to Richard Arthur, Bishop of Limerick, who caused this cross containing very ancient fragments of the most holy cross of Christ to be made through the generosity of Joanna Fox. And he dates it 1625. So for a long time it was assumed this was a 17th century cross. Note the hollow base. When Hunt looked more closely at it, the plates that plate the vertical of the cross are much earlier. They're 15th century, probably early 15th century. And they show scenes from the Nativity. So again, there's a Marian theme there. You have the relic of the true cross up here. And this shape of cross, a double-armed cross, is typical for a cross reliquary. Also of interest, and it resonates with that description from St. Macartan's, a base that held a relic with a shield on it. And what I think is interesting is you have this little setting which is heart-shaped, corn. There's no knell, unfortunately. But then you have the royal coat of arms in enamel on it. Was this also commissioned by Bishop O'Dee for his cathedral? Well, the question is, when might he have done this? If the choir had been elongated, the obvious is when the chancel or the high altar was reconsecrated. And there's always been a big puzzle over the date of the mitre and crozier, both dated, why even add the date, but both dated very explicitly to 1418. As you know, O'Dee became bishop in 1400, so you'd have thought if he was going to make something, he'd make it then. No, it's this random date. The only suggestion that I'm aware of that's been put forward is that perhaps it was made for great meetings of bishops in 1418. Both the Archbishop of Dublin and of Armagh new ones were invested, so maybe it was basically the party hat to go up and celebrate and blow the others out of the water with his new mitre. That seems a little far, maybe, who knows, but I would have thought it's much more likely that he wanted to be properly dressed for the consecration of his new chancel. And it was about right time-wise, 18 years thereabout, to build that extension, to have the stained glass fitted, and even perhaps to have the tombs fitted. So possibly he also commissions this cross as well for the high altar. Now, I was chatting with Charlotte earlier on, and I'm so glad I was, because I was about to say, it's written down in my notes, everybody has always suggested, bar two people, have always suggested that the fantastic misericords that survive in Limerick Cathedral are work from a later period, from the episcopacy of John Folan. So that's the very late 15th century. And the reason for this comes from a brief passage in the Arthur manuscripts again, that says that the nave of the Church of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was narrow and mouldering to decay, was enlarged, and several other additions were made, including the erection of 3 transepts, as well as the formation of various aisles. The citizens undertook the duty of decorating the cathedral. Now, that reference to 3 transepts has been interpreted as elongating the 2 south and north transepts, and perhaps also elongating the chancel. And on that basis, the misericords have been dated to Foilon's episcopacy. However, if the chancel had been extended earlier during the episcopacy of O'Dee, in order to make space for those fancy tombs and also to make space for a southern doorway, as the chantry chapels were probably blocking an earlier one, it stands to reason that O'Dea would also have commissioned, or got somebody else to pay for probably, new seats for the canons. As I've said, it's all about the liturgy and celebrating the liturgy. And as I've noted somewhere else I've published, that 14th century, early 15th century architecture tends to be very plain on the outside, and it was all about the furnishings at this time. When we read inventories and we find surviving documents. So I think, along with Maurice Lenihan and Charlotte, who I think she's spot on, I think these were probably actually commissioned during the episcopacy of Cornelius O'Dea to finish that fit out between the new choir screen that had the Arthur coat of arms over it and the high altar. And that's perhaps where they were intended for. And just to give another example, unfortunately they don't survive, but I mentioned the building of a new long choir at Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. It was demolished actually in 1870 because it was felt to be so ugly and really not worth keeping. But again, it wasn't about the outside, it was about the inside. And we have a couple of surviving drawings, actually of the stained glass, but also of the choir stalls that were erected in 1355 by the then Archbishop of Dublin. And you can see the intricacy of the carving. These are obviously the stalls that Limerick may never have had them. They were certainly made in the 19th century to go over the medieval ones. They possibly did. But I suppose the point being that these were bought as a piece with the extension of the choir. That's the whole point of extending the choir, is to provide seating. So I would argue there's no reason that those misericords have to be particularly late. You get very similar ones from the 14th century, in fact. So I don't wonder if O'Dea also is responsible for them. So we've got the Black Book, we've got his crozier and mitre, we've got him making a new tomb, we've got him probably overseeing the extension of the chancel. The one other thing, and just to wrap up, is a description of his seal. He sealed the will of Thomas Arthur, the individual who helped fund the building of the chancel. And it's described, and thanks to the beauty of AI, now I didn't get it quite right, but it was near enough, you just feed that description in, and this is what it spits out. But the thing that's really interesting here is that it explicitly states that it was flanked with, on his left-hand side, the arms of the Earls of Ormond, and on the right-hand side, the arms of the Earls of Desmond. And they haven't come up anywhere in dispatches in the documents to do with O'Dea. You wouldn't immediately associate them with Limerick. What's particularly interesting is that the document he sealed dates to 1426, and the only other place I'm aware of where you see those two coats of arms together is again on a piece of fake timber, a beautifully carved sedilia at Holy Cross Abbey. And actually the proximity of these two shields has been used to date all of the 15th century work in Holy Cross, because in 1429, the always at war Desmonds and Ormonds reached a very brief truce when Anne, the daughter of the Earl of Ormond, was betrothed to the son of the Earl of Desmond. So people suggest that this is to mark that great sort of making of peace. It didn't last because one of them ran off with somebody else, so they were back fighting quite soon. But it's interesting that they're actually occurring together on a D shield. I can't give you the answer, but I wonder again if it isn't politics. This is just around the time that he's summoned to Dublin to account for some sin that we don't know what it was, and that he tenders his resignation. Is he trying to curry favour with the two most powerful houses, political dynasties in Ireland at the time, perhaps to build even bigger, greater cathedrals, or to bedazzle us even more with additional sparkly things to add to the cathedral? We simply don't know, but I think again it's an avenue for further research. And really it just demonstrates that this person who we hear about vaguely in history, what impact he must have made on the people of Limerick during his episcopacy, introducing all of these wonderful works of art, both imported but also that are made right here in Limerick, and really show Limerick as a key player in the production of art and indeed tomb art in the early 15th century. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.